Hello, everybody. Welcome into another episode of the Fantasy Pros Football Podcast. I am Ryan Warmly, joined as I am every Sunday night by Matthew Friedman and Dr. Deepak Chona. Friedman, this was a wild week of games, as it seems to be every week. Maybe our craziest witching hour yet.
Yeah, maybe. I'm just so focused on Justin Herbert massively underperforming and breaking my heart from a sports betting perspective. But other than that, a pretty cool week.
Not the most surprising thing that he underperformed given the rib injury. Pretty surprising that he was still in the game late in the fourth quarter when they were down by 28 points with your franchise quarterback. Not sure what they were thinking there. Dr. Deepak Chona, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Fantasy teams are right in line, so here for a good weekend.
Good stuff going on. For those watching the show live on YouTube, thank you. We will be here every Sunday night around 7:45 Eastern all season long. If you're watching us here on youtube.com/fantasypros, please give us a like and be sure to subscribe to help us out if you enjoy our content. Click the bell to get notified of all of our latest podcasts, short videos, live streams, and more. And for the folks listening on the podcast, don't forget that we are live each and every Sunday night, so you can watch us along with every other Fantasy Pros podcast over on our YouTube channel. Again, that's youtube.com/fantasypros. I also want to mention, if you want a chance to win a signed Jalen Waddle Miami Dolphins jersey, he had another great day today, of course, courtesy of our friends at Pristine Auction, you need to subscribe to the Fantasy Pros YouTube channel right now. Comment below on this video, and that's it. We will be announcing a winner right here on the channel, so make sure to turn on those notifications so you can be alerted when new episodes up and get ready to claim your prize. A lot of injuries this week, unfortunately. The one downside of we saw here in week 3. So, Dr. Chona, I will just go right to you here. David Montgomery is the first guy I want to mention. He left early with the knee, ankle injury. I'm not sure exactly what it was. Something on the leg. Kahlil Herbet looked great in his absence. Do you think this is going to be a long-term thing for Montgomery?
It sounds pretty promising that it's not going to be a long-term thing. Video looked like a high ankle sprain, and the fact that they're calling it knee and ankle makes me think he's probably going to miss one game, but it would be in that 0 to 1 range most likely for Montgomery.
Friedman, we're going to get more into Herbert a little bit later, but just off the cuff right here, where would you have him ranked in any week that Montgomery is not playing?
He's got to be an RB1. If not RB1, high-end RB2.
Next running back I want to talk about is Dalvin Cook. He left with, they said arm early. I think it ended up being a dislocated shoulder, which, Deepak, I know you were worried about.
Yeah, this is a big deal for Dalvin Cook. I think he had a tear in there, and when you have a tear already, it makes it a little bit unstable. Now having the dislocation, that tear probably is bigger. So there's a good likelihood they can get him back. Usually in the 1 week or so is roughly what the recovery takes to get back acutely. So you may see him play next week, but the recurrence risk here is very high in season. So I'd be investing in Alexander Mattison at pretty much all costs.
Yeah, Friedman, I was going to bring up Mattison because he's basically the number one handcuff. At least he was going into drafts for a lot of people, maybe behind Tony Pollard, but he was certainly in that upper echelon. So same question as Herbert. Where would he rank in any week that Dalvin Cook is not playing?
Yeah, you basically treat him as if he's Dalvin Cook, except he doesn't have another Alexander Mattison behind him. So rank him as if he's Dalvin.
A quarterback who got hurt very late in the game was Mac Jones. And Deepak, it looked really bad when he was coming off the field. It was literally the very last few minutes of the game, and he couldn't put any weight at all on that left leg. What did you see, and what are you hearing?
Yeah, the video here looks like a high ankle sprain. The fact that he had negative x-rays means he'll probably get an MRI tomorrow. I'm expecting, based on his reaction, for it to be on the higher severity. And for position players, that usually means like 4 to 6 weeks. Quarterbacks can sometimes push that to the 2 to 4 range. So we'll know a little more after the MRI, but look for at least a multi-week absence here.
Friedman, this passing offense was already barely touchable. Is it completely untouchable in terms of fantasy if Mac Jones is out?
Yeah, I think so. It's about the same. Brian Hoyer, he seems like he'd be the one who would come in, but maybe at some point they would give Bailey Zappi a chance to see what, the rookie can do. But, Hoyer is a functional veteran. He would be fine, but there would be nothing special about the offense.
Another QB that gave us a scare did end up coming back in the game was Tua Tagovailoa. Deepak, he hit his head, so a lot of people thought it was a concussion. He was kind of wobbling. There was a tweet out there saying that it's actually his back kind of locked up, so that's why he was wobbling. He had sort of tweaked it earlier in the game. What do you think is the takeaway here?
Yeah, based on how fast he came back, then the fact that Rappaport was the one who put that tweet out about the back, I'm leaning towards that as the explanation. Back spasms are usually something that can recur for quarterbacks, but pocket QBs usually don't miss time. They can generally play through these things. So that's kind of what I'm expecting for Tua. No major performance impact, but there is going to be that risk for the next few weeks that these could recur.
And Deepak, another guy that I wanted to ask you about, even before the day started, was J.K. Dobbins, because we finally get to see him back on the field for the first time in 20 months. It has been a long road for this Ravens fan, wanting to see him back on the field with that offense. He didn't look amazing, but he didn't appear to have any injury issues whatsoever. A bit of a pitch count, as you would expect coming back. Is this, where would you rank this in terms of what you were hoping to see out of him in his first game back on the field?
Yeah, I think this is right within expectations, about 9 touches and a little over 3 yards per rush. And you're looking at J.K. Dobbins regaining his footing over the course of the next 4 weeks is usually how long they take running backs to ramp up their snap count. And then beyond that, you're looking towards the second half of the season when he really starts to pick up his explosiveness, his form. So probably looking like 85-90% of his old self by the week 10 to 12 range. But you're going to see the training wheels on him for the next probably 4 weeks.
Friedman, are you going to start Dobbins during this stretch when we think we'll see the training wheels on him, or are you going to be sitting him until you're fully comfortable he's all the way back?
Yeah, I don't think you can start him unless you're absolutely desperate. Maybe, if they ramp up the usage a little bit, he's getting 10 to 12 touches, in which case, yeah, like maybe he's flexible, especially in a good matchup, but you would hope to be able to start someone who's getting more usage.
One last guy quickly for you, Deepak. I didn't see a ton of information out on Michael Thomas. He did leave the game with a foot injury. Did you see anything here?
Yeah, well, the fact that he was testing it right after, before he went to the locker room, suggests kind of a milder severity. They did mention toe, so most likely we're dealing with a turf toe here. And for wide receivers, a lot of them, they are battling these during the year and often don't have to miss any games. We'll know a little bit more from the practice reports, and they'll probably get an MRI this week that we'll hear about. So usually 0 to 1 games is what we're looking at.
There were a number of names that left games but then ended up coming back. So I'll just run through them really quickly. Garrett Wilson, T. Higgins, Dallas Goedert, Amon-Ra St. Brown. A lot of people in Miami, which appeared to be just because of the heat. There was a lot of cramping going on. So those guys all did leave their games, but they all did return. Just something to keep an eye on throughout the week in case there's any lingering effects. He is Dr. Deepak Chona. He will be back with us every single week. Friedman and I will be back in just a few seconds here, so don't go anywhere. Want to dominate your fantasy football leagues? Well, then you need My Playbook, available only from FantasyPros. Struggling with the waiver wire? My Playbook lets you see who the top available players are week to week. Can't decide who to start? Compare your players side by side with detailed breakdowns and projections for each week of your fantasy season. And it's all free when you're a premium subscriber to FantasyPros. So sign up today at FantasyPros.com or download the My Playbook app to your Apple or Android device. Friedman, I promise that I'm not going to come on here wearing Ravens gear every time that Baltimore wins a game, but our number one headline of the day is about Lamar Jackson, so I felt it was only fitting to wear his jersey on this live stream. All we wrote down, and you actually wrote this down separately for me, but we had the same thought, is Lamar Jackson the fantasy QB1? Josh Allen has done nothing to lose that title so far, but Lamar's just looked unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, it's a toss-up, I think, any given week moving forward, whether it's Jackson or Allen or Mahomes, just kind of dependent on matchup. But in week 3, Lamar Jackson on the road against the Patriots, who have a defense I respect, he put up 40.4 fantasy points, great passing line, 218 yards, 4 passing touchdowns, just 1 interception. And again, over 100 yards rushing and a touchdown on the ground. He has 3+ touchdowns passing in all 3 games this year. Back-to-back games with 100 yards rushing. Obviously Allen and Mahomes are great, but Jackson might be playing better than them right now. Like, he looks like 2019 MVP Lamar.
I think he honestly looks a little bit better. He has a worse supporting cast in terms of the offensive line, which does concern me, but he has looked just unbelievable. We put out a stat on the Fantasy Pros Twitter account earlier this afternoon, and it still is true after the late afternoon games. He leads the league in passer rating and in passing touchdowns, and he's 3rd amongst all players in rushing yards right now, behind 2 guys who have like twice as many carries as him. So he has been unbelievable this season, both in fantasy and real life. A guy who was unbelievable today for our second headline was Kahlil Herbet. Like we mentioned, put up a ridiculous stat line in the absence of David Montgomery. I'm totally with you. He's clearly an RB1 in games that Montgomery doesn't play. I mean, I don't really know what else to say about him other than he just looked incredible.
Yeah, handcuff extraordinaire. I think he's actually, I mean, we just kind of have to see how they split the backfield in Minnesota because there are some other good runners there. But Kahlil Herbet, like he's it. If Montgomery is out, like he is the guy who's going to be getting the super majority of the workload. And, we talked about David Montgomery leaving early in week 3 with the ankle and knee injuries. And Herbert stepped up in a massive way, 29.9 fantasy points on 20 carries and two receptions. I mean, 100 and 69 yards and 2 touchdowns. Matt Eberflus said that Montgomery is day to day. He might not miss any games, but if he's out, I mean, we have to slot Herbert in as a fantasy RB1.
Do you think this performance was good enough that we might be in a position to consider starting him even when Montgomery is on the field? Do you think it's the type of thing that might make the Bears say we should be giving this guy more touches?
Maybe, but we can't do it's really risky to put him out there and start him as fantasy managers if we haven't seen that split yet. And he's got the talent to warrant that split. And it is a run heavy Bears offense that we're dealing with. So if they decide to go that route, there is the possibility that he could be flexible in those circumstances, but I'm skeptical until we actually see it.
Our third headline is Devonta Smith, who has gotten better every single week this season. Statistically, he obviously was super talented even coming into the year. Is he a fantasy wide receiver 1? Not the wide receiver 1, but a wide receiver 1 going forward?
Yeah, I mean, he had a strong rookie year last year, over 900 yards, 5 touchdowns receiving. He underwhelmed in weeks 1 and 2, just 11 targets for 80 scoreless yards. Obviously, in week 3, totally different story. Went off a team high 12 targets, 169 yards and a touchdown. I think he's going to be inconsistent week to week. Given that the Eagles are likely to have run heavy game scripts, they're going to be leading in a lot of games, and he needs to compete for targets with, 2 really good pass catchers in AJ Brown and Dallas Goedert. But I think by the end of the year, he could have cumulative wide receiver 1 production. Like he actually might be the T Higgins to AJ Brown's Jamar Chase.
That's a great comparison. And I was going to ask you, I think I know the answer, but AJ Brown still would be ranked ahead of Smith going forward. I think most people would feel that way. I just want to sort of confirm it.
Yeah, I believe so, but we just kind of have to see. You go where the usage dictates you go. And, Devonta Smith has gotten significant usage over the past couple of weeks.
So far, surprisingly, this does look like an offense that can support 2 really impactful fantasy wideouts. And then our last headline of the day at the tight end position, Tyler Conklin. What we wrote down in the notes was, are you for real? He had 8 catches, 84 yards. This was not a name that I think was on a lot of people's radars coming into the year. Through 3 weeks, seems to be maybe a guy you can use.
Yeah, he was one of the players I highlighted in my week 3 favorites. Not because I think he's actually that good of a player or anything, but it's just tight end is a wasteland, and Conklin might actually be an oasis in the desert, right? It helps that Joe Flacco is dropping back to pass 52 times per game, seemingly every game. At some point, that's going to regress, and Zach Wilson is going to come back. But Conklin entered week 3 with an every down role and getting 8 targets per game, and then we saw him in week 3 play a lot of snaps and get another 8 targets. And, he produced with those targets, 12.4 fantasy points, 84 yards receiving on 8 receptions. That's not going to lead you to a fantasy championship, but everyone is desperate for tight end production right now. And you could do a lot worse than 8 targets per game. And Conklin is out there in a ton of leagues.
Really quickly, we know that Joe Flacco loves throwing to tight ends. Are you concerned that once Zach Wilson is back there, that this, sort of dream start to the season for Conklin is going to fall off?
Maybe, but it helps that Conklin is out there every snap and running routes on almost every drop back.
That's fair. Let's move to the rest of our slate here today. We'll start with Raiders at Titans. To me, the biggest takeaway here was Mack Hollins. Not a stat line I expected. 8 catches, 158 yards, and a touchdown. Was the clear wide receiver 1 for today, at least in terms of this game. What did you notice out of him? Did you see something that makes you think this is repeatable?
Yeah, I mean, it came in a game without number 2 wide receiver Hunter Renfrow, who was out with a concussion. So we have to keep that in mind. But Holland also had 8 targets last week in week 2, and he's locked into 3 wide receiver sets. So yeah, he needs to be rostered in most leagues, and he actually might be a viable starting option in deep formats.
On the flip side, Devontae Adams only had 36 yards. He did have a touchdown. This is now back-to-back weeks that he hasn't looked very great.
Yeah, I mean, you assume it's going to shake out. He had the 10 targets, so that's encouraging, but it's not all great in Las Vegas.
I'll just quickly note on the running backs, Josh Jacobs, 13 rushes, 66 yards, 5 catches. Despite being questionable going into this game, he traveled late to Tennessee. And then Derrick Henry, 20 rushes, 85 yards. Also had 5 catches for 58 yards, not something we usually see out of him. Next game, Saints at Panthers. For the second straight week, we're talking about Chris Olave with 13 targets, 147 yards this time.
Yeah, I mean, in week 2, Olave had an obscene 334 air yards on 13 targets. In week 3, he turned that usage into actual fantasy production. It's really encouraging for a rookie that he's already being used as if he's the number 1 wide receiver for the Saints.
I know we don't want to compare anybody to one of the great players in the game, and we'll talk more about Justin Jefferson later. But remember, his rookie season, it was week 3 that he had that blow up and then basically never looked back, was a wide receiver 1 the rest of the year. Is there any chance we see that out of Olave too?
I doubt it, because you do have other really good wide receivers there on the team. And also Alvin Kamara is going to get his fair share of targets, but Olave certainly has revealed himself to be someone who has a lot of upside.
CMC and Alvin Kamara in this game combined for 40 carries, but they only combined for 4 catches. These are 2 players that we know are really good at catching the ball out of the backfield. So hopefully those numbers go up moving forward. But the other guy I want to ask you about is DJ Moore, because for like the 3rd straight week, we got a lot of tweets saying, should we be considering dropping him? Actually, not just benching him, but dropping him. 6 targets, 1 singular catch for 2 yards. Obviously not a touchdown. Woof.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned him on the Friday matchup show as someone that you would probably want to downgrade it, that we had a tough start-sit decision with him because of the matchup. And I mean, we saw that come to bear. It gets better. Arizona next week, week 4, you start DJ Moore next week.
I have a lot of shares of DJ Moore, so I certainly hope it is going to get better. Chiefs at Colts, one of the surprise upsets of the day. The fantasy takeaway I had, because this is a pretty low-scoring game, was Clyde Edwards-Helaire, 7 rushes for 0 yards, but he did score a touchdown.
It's unbelievable. This is gross, right? He saved his day with the touchdown. He had some receiving production, had 5 targets, which he turned into 39 yards on 5 receptions, but he lost carries to backups Jerick McKinnon and Isaiah Pacheco, and he was outrushed by seemingly everyone on the team. Here's another way of looking at it. He led the team in carries, and yet he somehow managed to outrush nobody. That is unfathomable. And this performance came against a team missing all-pro linebacker Shaquille Leonard. This is just, it's not Edwards-Helaire, it's Edwards horrible. I screwed that up. That's not good. That's not a good pun. It's a horrible pun. It's an Edwards-Helaire horrible pun. But this is I just need to stop talking now. Save me.
A for effort, D- for execution.
Absolutely.
Patrick Mahomes actually led the Chiefs in rushing yards today, to give you a sense of how bad the rushing attack was from Kansas City. Juju Smith-Schuster, 5 catches for 89 yards. A nice game from him. Michael Pittman Jr. returned to the field, 8 catches, 72 yards. No concerns there, I would assume long-term. Jonathan Taylor, any concerns? Not that he had a horrific day. He wasn't Clyde Edwards horrible, but 21 rushes, 71 yards. Certainly not what you're expecting from a guy that was a top 2 pick in every league. No,
I mean, obviously the fantasy production wasn't what you'd want, but he had 21 carries and 5 targets. Like that's super elite. Just you would take that every week.
We already talked about Lamar Jackson in our next game, Ravens at Patriots. Ravens, of course, the victors there. So I want to ask about Mark Andrews. We asked if Lamar is the QB1 going forward overall. Is Mark Andrews tight end 1 ahead of Travis Kelce? He had 8 catches, 89 yards, 2 touchdowns. The way that Lamar is playing and knowing that Andrews is his favorite target, that's a pretty compelling case.
Yeah, 13 targets in that game. He's not just the number 1 receiver on the team, and by a healthy margin. Yeah, he should be moving forward the default fantasy tight end 1 in rankings moving forward, unless there's something compelling about the matchup for Kelce or for Andrews. But I mean, his target volume is elite. The prolific output of his offense is nearly unrivaled. Yeah, he has to be the tight end 1 moving forward as just like your default no-brainer. Think about it. And then you look more at the context to see if you bump him down to number 2.
What's your concern level with Rashod Bateman? 3rd straight week. He produced the first 2, but this is the 3rd straight week that he hasn't had a lot of targets.
Yeah, he's not going to have a lot of targets. They're using something of a wide receiver rotation. And I think they're just kind of working him into the system, but it's clear like Mark Andrews is the number 1 option and everyone else is kind of like fighting to see how significant they can make the number 2 role.
Just sticking with the Ravens for one more player here. I want to ask a little bit about Justice Hill because he had 6 carries for 60 yards. He only got 1 fewer carry than Dobbins. Dobbins was the starter early in the game, but Hill looked like the better running back. Should fantasy managers be considering picking him up at all?
I'm super skeptical about that. I mean, yeah, he did have a nice run, broke off a 34-yarder, got some chunk yardage, but I mean, I'm really doubtful that he actually ends up overtaking J.K. Dobbins. But it is notable that he was the number 2 back. It wasn't Kenyon Drake. It wasn't Mike Davis. It was Justice Hill. And so that means he should probably be rostered. I don't think you start him, but he should be rostered.
Drake was a healthy scratch today. Ramondre Stevenson, 73 yards and a touchdown. Damian Harris, 41 and a touchdown. Devontae Parker, 5 catches, 156 yards. To me, that was just a result of going up against a battered down secondary that has really not been able to stop anybody the last 2 weeks. Game number 5, Texans at Bears. We talked about Kahlil Herbet already. So I want to ask sort of on the other side, Justin Fields, 8 of 17, 106 yards, 2 interceptions. He has attempted 45 total passes through 3 weeks of the 2022 season. I mean, I don't want to ask if he's droppable because I know the upside's there. And if you're in a league where you're owning him already, you're probably not wanting to drop your backup quarterback. But how droppable is he?
He's droppable. I mean, he's eminently droppable given how little he's actually throwing the ball. And it's not as if they're using him in like a souped up way as a runner either. Yeah, he did have 8 carries, but like if he's not throwing the ball, you would hope to see him have like 15 carries or something like that. So yeah, he's very droppable. The guy who really catches my eye in this game was on the other side, running back Dameon Pierce. Again, 20 carries, like just dominating the backfield. And he had 2 targets, which he turned into 21 yards. So over 100 yards in total for the second week in a row, well ahead of number 2 running back Rex Burkhead. He's locked in as a fantasy RB2 at this point.
Do you think there's upside for a fantasy RB1 season, or is it going to be 2?
I think it's RB2 in part because the Texans offense leaves a lot to be desired. So it's hard for a back really to outperform if he's in an offense that is just dragging him down, but he's getting enough usage each week to be a pretty solid RB2.
Want to take a quick second to remind the listeners that if they want even more access to our analysts, be sure to join us on Discord at fantasypros.com/chat. A premium subscription will get listeners full access to our analysts through AMAs, stages, and more. Our next game was the one that probably most people were most excited about coming into the week. Bills at Dolphins. Dolphins ended up winning one I know they're 2-0, but still pretty clearly an upset here. Fantasy takeaway, Isaiah McKenzie had 76 yards and a touchdown. Stephon Diggs, 7 catches, 74 yards. Diggs was one of those guys who came off for a short bit with the cramping in that heat.
Yeah, Isaiah McKenzie is the guy who really caught my eye with the 9 targets. In weeks 1 and 2, McKenzie and wide receiver Jamison Crowder split time in the slot. They cannibalized production from each other. Both had just 6 targets for 4 receptions. They were basically useless for fantasy. But in week 3, McKenzie obviously separated himself, really outperformed with the 9 targets to just 3 for Crowder. And, he displayed, an overall playmaking skill set that Crowder just doesn't have. So if McKenzie really starts to see regular usage, that's awesome for him, awesome for the Bills offense, great for quarterback Josh Allen, probably pretty bad for people who are invested in number 2 wide receiver Gabe Davis.
Yeah, unfortunate for them. Jalen Waddle, 104 yards, 4 catches. Tyreek Hill, only 33 yards. Not really any long-term concern there. I want to ask you which running back performance you thought was more significant for fantasy. Devin Singletary getting 9 catches out of the backfield. He had 78 yards receiving and a touchdown. Or Chase Edmonds only getting 6 carries but scoring both touchdowns.
Yeah, I mean, I doubt that Edmonds is going to have that kind of touchdown conversion rate moving forward. It is encouraging to see a back used heavily in the receiving game the way Singletary was, but he's not going to get 9 targets on a regular basis in any game this season. So I'm kind of discounting both performances. It's more meaningful that we saw Edmonds really get very little usage.
Eagles at Commanders. We already talked about Devonta Smith, and we talked about Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes sort of being that upper echelon of fantasy quarterbacks. Should Jalen Hurts be in that conversation, or is he at the top of the next tier?
I don't know. I mean, Jalen Hurts, pretty routinely is being ranked in the top 3 in our expert consensus at Fantasy Pros. I'm pretty sure he was there this week. If he wasn't, he was number 4. I mean, he's right there. He's one of the top quarterbacks in the league. And, given how we've seen the Eagles play, Hurts is right there in the MVP discussion as well.
Yeah, the MVP discussion and the fantasy MVP discussion.
Yes.
Seems like
the real MVP discussion.
The MVP that we care about.
Yeah.
On the other side of that, game, Carson Wentz he stinks out loud. 25 of 43, 211 yards, no interceptions, got sacked a bunch, looked overall not very good. Antonio Gibson, another week of decent volume, but not decent production, but then also falling into the end zone.
Yeah. And Terry McLaurin looked good on the 9 targets, which he turned into 102 yards receiving. It was nice to get that kind of performance from him, but like he was still out targeted by wide receiver Curtis Samuel, and running back JD McKissick had 9 targets. Wide receiver Jahan Dotson had 8 targets. So in terms of overall talent, McLaurin might be like a top 12 overall wide receiver, but it just seems clear that with the way the Commanders are spreading the ball around this year, he's not going to dominate the offense the way that he did in previous years.
Lions at Vikings. We're now 3 weeks in, and Detroit is one of the highest scoring offenses in football. So that's been really fun and also surprising. Jamaal Williams, 20 rushes, 87 yards, and 2 touchdowns. DeAndre Swift just had the 7 carries for 31 yards.
Yeah, I mean, Swift is dealing with that ankle injury. That's going to linger for a little bit of time. So Williams is getting the opportunity to contribute in significant ways. Entering week 3, he had a league high 7 carries inside the 10-yard line. He had 13 combined carries plus targets in each of weeks 1 and 2, and then obviously went off in week 3 with the extra workload on the 20 touches. Like, he is a viable flex option each week because this Lions offense, they like to run and they can support that type of production with how prolific they are.
Yeah, the fact that Williams was leading the NFL in carries inside the 10-yard line, even before this game, was pretty wild. Adam Thielen and KJ Osborne each caught touchdowns. Justin Jefferson, 3 catches for 14 yards. We came on the show in week 1 and said there's a very real chance that he should have been ranked wide receiver 1 going into this year, even ahead of Cooper Kupp. The last 2 weeks now, he has not looked like that. And week 3, now the week 1 looks like the outlier here. I'm not saying that I think Justin Jefferson is going to be bad, but should we be, if not panicking, at least concerned?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit concerned, not because of his talent, but because of the way that they're spreading the ball around. And I don't think that the Lions were really doing anything to take Justin Jefferson away. It's just that other guys were able to get open against the Lions because they're the Lions, So I think it was just throwing to the open man. But Jefferson still, I think a top 3 fantasy wide receiver in terms of how you rank him.
Yeah, week 3 is always interesting because week 1 is overreaction week. And then week 2, you don't know which of the weeks is the one that's kind of fishy. Week 3, you start to see a pattern develop. So certainly we hope he turns it around soon and looks more like the guy we saw in week 1. Last game on our early slate, Bengals at Jets. Cincinnati finally gets a win. Breece Hall had 11 targets. He only had 6 catches for 53 yards, but he's getting a lot of looks in the passing game.
Yeah, I mean, through 3 games, he has 21 carries and 21 targets. Now, that receiving usage is almost certain to regress, but his rushing workload is also probably going to increase at some point. But either way, we're looking at a rookie running back getting 14 opportunities per game. Like, that's someone who's going to have my attention.
I believe this was the first game that he outsnapped Michael Carter too. So something to look going forward in that committee. Joe Burrow had 275 yards, 3 touchdowns. Most of that production came in the first half. T. Higgins left and then came back into the game after that scary-looking hit. He also was robbed of an incredible touchdown catch that should have counted. He ended up with 5 catches for 93 yards. Jamar Chase had 10 targets, only 29 yards. He did find the end zone. And then Tyler Boyd, 4 catches, 105 yards, and a touchdown. Are you considering ranking Boyd in an area where you would consider starting him as long as Higgins and Chase are still in the field? Or is he strictly a really high-end wide receiver handcuff?
Yeah, he's a handcuff, and I would say in deeper leagues, he's certainly a flex option if you just need it, especially during the bye weeks. We're starting to get with the bye weeks in range. At that point, you will start to consider Boyd as someone you'd want to slot into your lineup. But he had, I believe, just 5 targets in this game. Obviously, he had a whole bunch of production on that 5 targets, but that's the kind of usage you can't really count on.
4 games here in the late afternoon slate. Jaguars at Chargers, probably the most surprising upset, unless you consider Herbert's, limited status to be a real significant play there. I know you were not happy about it from a betting perspective. Trevor Lawrence, 28 of 39, 262 yards, 3 touchdowns. He had a couple rushing attempts as well. He looks like the real deal, and he has since week 1.
Yeah, Lawrence, he looked good in week 3, and he's looked good up to this point. I was so focused on Justin Herbert entering week 3 that I kind of forgot about Lawrence, but he's legit. In weeks 1 and 2, he was the number 4 quarterback in the league in composite expected points added and completion percentage over expectation. Like, that is a real stat. Like, he's up there with the best quarterbacks in the league right now. And then in week 3, he went against a strong Charger secondary and took it to them. Like, he might not be a weekly fantasy starter yet, but he's definitely in the streaming conversation each week. And I think he's right on that QB1, QB2 borderline.
I believe we had James Robinson as RB18 rest of season heading into week 3. Were we too low?
I don't know. It's tough because we can't really count yet on the Jags offense. Like, each week that we see them improve, then you trust in James Robinson a little bit more, but he still has Travis Etienne behind him. But yeah, I mean, we need to move him up incrementally each week we see him outperform.
Speaking of running backs, Austin Ekeler did have 8 catches, but he only had 4 rushes for 5 yards. What's the panic meter there?
It's bad. It feels very bad. I mean, let's say if it's 1 to 10, like, I'm probably at like a 7.9.
I think that's unfortunately pretty reasonable. Next game, Rams at Cardinals. What was the takeaway here? The game was closer than I expected it to be, but not quite as high scoring.
Yeah, I mean, Marquise Brown, 17 targets, which he turned into 14 receptions, 140 yards. Now, obviously, 17 targets, that's not like a reasonable projection for any given week moving forward. But through 3 weeks, he has 34 targets. He's the clear number 1 receiver for the Cardinals, and they're likely to have pass-heavy situations moving forward. Even when DeAndre Hopkins returns from his suspension, I think Brown actually might end up being the wide receiver atop the depth chart.
3 different receivers in the Arizona offense had at least 10 targets in that one to give you a sense of how much Kyler was throwing the ball. And Cam Akers looked like RB1 in this backfield. He did have the fumble at the goal line. You cross your fingers as a fantasy manager that that's not going to be held against him by Sean McVay, but it certainly wouldn't be the first time.
No, it was great usage for him. And, he looked a little more explosive. I thought, 12 carries for 61 yards, did have the touchdown. Excellent usage. You're starting to feel like you can use Cam Akers if you need to.
Cordarelle Patterson had a big day in our next game, Falcons at Seahawks. 17 rushing attempts, 141 yards, and a touchdown. He also had a really sick-looking hurdle that just was like very aesthetically pleasing. Were we too low on him going into the year when pretty much everybody and their mother was screaming regression?
Yeah, I mean, I say the industry was too low. Like, I've been high on Cordarelle Patterson for the entirety of his career. So like, I was probably too high on him like the first 6-7 years, and like appropriately high on him this year, but it's still inconsistency. Like, that's what we're going to see. Like, he was, kind of underwhelming in week 2. He had 41 yards on 10 carries and 1 target. So I was skeptical that we would get to see him play as a lead back this week, but he did it. The Falcons had a run heavy game script, and Patterson had 17 carries and a target too. So he was the team's primary playmaker. Again, he's going to be inconsistent on a week to week basis, but barring injury, he should finish with another 1,000 yards and double digit touchdowns, because that is the way that they are using him.
It wasn't a huge blow-up spot we were hoping for from Kyle Pitts, but he did lead the team in both targets and receiving. Marcus Mariota only threw the ball 20 times, so there just wasn't a lot of passing yards to go around. Drake London did find the end zone again. He, like Olave and like Garrett Wilson before the injury, just all these rookie receivers look like really good early impact guys.
Yeah, London looks great. It's not like just the usage, but like he looks the part. He looks like a real number 1 wide receiver.
Rashad Penny, 14 carries, 66 yards. Tyler Lockett, 9 catches, 76. DK Metcalf, 5 catches, 64. And a touchdown. Not much takeaways there, sort of roughly in line what we expected, but just to mention them. And then our last game, Packers at Bucks. A lot of people looked at this game and saw Aaron Rodgers versus Tom Brady and said we got 2 guys who looked fairly washed. I mean, we've been calling Tom Brady washed for like 7 years, so I certainly don't want to say he's finished, but did not look good in this game, and neither did Rodgers, really.
Yeah, I mean, this was kind of a predictable game in the way that it played out. The over-under had moved down on the week, and you have 2 quarterbacks who have offensive lines that are, fairly injured, diminished wide receiver groups, run-heavy offenses going against 2 defenses that have great secondaries. Like, you kind of expected this game to be low scoring, and we saw that. But, Romeo Doubs, he really stood out to me. 8 targets, He turned that into 8 receptions, 73 yards, and a touchdown. In week 3, the Packers were without Sammy Watkins, without Christian Watson, and that gave Dobbs a chance to play as a regular in 3 wide sets, and he smashed with that opportunity. 17.3 fantasy points. The Packers are likely to remain a run-focused team for the entirety of the season, but Dobbs has a very real chance to emerge as the number 1 receiver for Aaron Rodgers.
I just noticed this looking at the box score. I didn't realize before. Aaron Jones, 12 rushes for 36 yards. A.J. Dillon, 12 rushes for 32 yards. Leonard Fournette, 12 rushes for 35 yards. That could not have been more close together. Which of those lines was your favorite?
They all tasted about the same to me.
He is Matthew Freeman. I am Ryan Wormley. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Like I said at the beginning of the show, we will be here every single Sunday night all season long. So be sure to tune in 7:45 Eastern, leading into Sunday Night Football. Hope everybody had a good week 3, and we'll see you again next week.